Here are two more figures. These people were probably dead for many years before this sculpture was created, and the person who created the sculpture may not have even known what they looked like. The role of this person is depicted as knight with his sword, queen or princess of some type. The polychrome here is rather dull, but you can see this actually was colored, probably much more vividly. The idea here was still to not worry too much about who was being represented, but to hang a name on them and honor the person with something that represented the role they had in life. In this same era, it was rather unusual to depart from pattern books. The reason this is included in this chapter is that this is one of the examples where an artist actually was expected to take a look at something that he had never seen before and draw it. Now, we take this for granted these days. We see people in the park painting pictures. We see their interpretation of a scene. We kind of expect that's what art is all about. Somebody interprets something, and we see a little bit of their mind at work. An elephant sent from one royal to another had never been seen in England. And this artist drew a picture of it. He sketched it out. In fact, he even included somebody here just for sizing purposes, and this in Latin says you can tell how big the animal is by comparing him to the height of this man. So the intention was to really represent how large this animal was. But this was unusual. One of the few instances this early that indicates somebody actually doing what we now consider to be commonplace for people with an artistic talent, and that is taking something from real life, using their eyes and attempting to depict it. This is an interesting marble relief from the same era. It looks very confused and jumbled to us because the idea here was to combine several different scenes from the Bible and sort of all jumbled together, almost like a collage. The artist here did this in a rather skillful way, and we can also see with the folds of the cloth here and the gentle sloping of this body, something of the artistry creeping back in, getting away from these very rigid forms. As Gombrich points out, a sculptor really has an easier time of it in representing depth because the creation of the sculptor is something that has depth. It's 3D. This shocked people at the time because what Giotto di Bondone did was to represent on a flat surface a number of cues that would make you think that this was 3D, that this was a sculpture. But it's not. It's actually just a flat piece of artwork. It's a fresco. The way that he gave it some sense of depth uses various elements of perspective. Here we have what's called a light perspective. You see the shading that occurs here between these folds, dark in shadow, light where the light can be reflected, and much more light here, as well as this effect on the face, which we've seen before, but done here in such a way that the shading and the light here make this look to you the same way that a 3D object would look with light shining on it. This is called light perspective. It's also given the Italian name of chiaroscuro. So that's another type of perspective we're going to be taking a look at. There is in your workbook on page 46 a summary of perspective techniques. This would be a really good thing for you to look at and to highlight for yourself. It's in chapter 4. That's a little write-up I did to describe for you the 5 different types of perspective. And here we have another fresco by Giotto, Morning of Christ. This one shows another type of perspective as well. I wonder if you can pick out what type of perspective is represented here from the list on page 46. Happens to be the very last one on the bottom of page 46. It's called positional perspective, and it's so simple that it's easy to overlook it. Positional perspective just simply means that we take a psychological cue that this object, for example, is closer to us than this one because the one that's closer blocks some of the one that's behind. The same thing is happening here. This is blocking some of that. This person is blocking some of that person. This person is blocking some of that. There actually is a conscious attempt here to show depth here. Not much depth, but some. And that makes this look more realistic to us. Now, you may think, as I did, that this is also an illustration, this being a ledge and this being depth over here, that back here that Giotto had used some form of atmospheric perspective, showing this to be in the distance. I don't think that was an intended effect. I think that results from the aging of the pigments here in this fresco, and the splotchy nature of it is just perhaps the nature of fresco painting over large surfaces. It's a tough thing to make this come out rather flat. So maybe with aging this has taken on even a greater sense of depth to us. It really does look like this is some sort of a canyon back here, and this is a very steep drop-off. So Giotto is a very large figure in the world of art. his work is many times taken as the beginning of the era of the Renaissance because he experimented with these types of perspective. Now, I'm going to run through these slides rather quickly to help you understand some of the terminology. Transept is the side parts of the church here that sometimes architects created churches like this to look like the shape of a cross if you were to look straight down at it. Side chapels like this existed because they were funded by individual wealthy families, and this is where various rituals like a christening would occur for people within that family. The apse here is where the altar is, and there's typically a dome over this area. These side chapels had another function. They actually formed extra supports like buttressing, not flying buttresses, but buttresses here on the ground for the walls that supported the dome. The dome was heavy, and it needed, in many cases, extra support. That's why, in fact, these things are the same type of buttresses here to support the wall from falling outward. This type of a church wouldn't have flying buttresses. Here we have some of the terminology associated with Gothic architecture. This tracery exists to form these shapes in windows. And these little ornaments here with either 3 circles or 4 circles, trifoil or quatrefoil windows, the tri or the quattro just meaning 3 or 4, very narrow ornamental types of columns here, and then column here, many times formed with what looked like round rods of stone. That's just the shape that way to make them seem thinner than they really are. And here's how a window would have been formed of individual pieces of stone that were cut out using these types of patterns. So a stone cutter would use a pattern like that to create these, and then they would be joined together with metal straps so that that's what forms the actual tracery. Here's the way columns were formed, and this, if you think back to that cathedral in Siena, you'll notice that because these shapes have been cut out this way to fit together in layers, that's why it was possible to rather readily make layers of alternating types of stone to get that zebra pattern. Here, the construction of it actually was the joining together, the mortaring together of these separate pieces and putting concrete or some other kind of rubble here in the middle of it. So the column was built up in these pieces to provide support in the church. And this is the way a stairway might have been constructed with these triangular blocks, so that as you come up here, you wind up going up these steps, and the wall here has been taken away just so that you can see this. Rather steep steps, but a central column here with this sort of a keyhole arrangement so that these were placed and spaced around them to form these kind of steps in a circular stairway. Now here, when we've referred to false work, this is the kind of wooden members that would have been carved and joined together with pegs to form the support for arches as the arch was being constructed. Then this wood would be moved away and perhaps used to construct another arch. This is sometimes called centering, this false work that held up the members of an arch until they were all cemented in place and ready to support themselves. And here's the way that false work would have been used to create the flying buttresses. This outside wall is actually the mass that supports the external pressure, this pushing out pressure, and these flying buttresses, that's the false work. We're going to see how in just a second that's used to form the stone arch, and then the false work is removed. So this is what it looks like once this stonework was in place, and the flying buttresses here were helping to provide support for this wall so that it didn't bow out with the weight of the roof above it. This is the way the interior here in this place would have looked. This is the flat floor, and this great wheel was a kind of a crane that was used with a man walking inside of it and a rope around it. The man walking would cause the rope to come up, and that's how they would haul up large amounts of building materials. So here you see false work forming the interior ceiling of the church, and here we see all these individual blocks having been placed on the false work and the keystone set in place and this being cemented. And once that cemented set, then this false work would be removed, perhaps moved over, and this arch would stand by itself. This provided those ribs for the interior ceiling. Now here, what's actually happening is these areas also function like arches in this way, and that's how they're supporting themselves to form something that just completes the ceiling but doesn't really have any structural work to do. The real weight of the ceiling is being borne by these cemented in place with this exterior coating of cement, and the inside perhaps coated in the same way. So this is what this cathedral looks like, sort of looks like Notre Dame Cathedral. And here's Notre Dame once again, so you can see the similarity between the illustration and this. And that's the end of the slides for Chapter 10.